If there's one thing that many magicians and occultists attempt to distance themselves from, that would be New Age. If you are unaware of what New Age is, I'm sure that you at least know somebody who owns a lot of crystals. They maybe have a dream catcher in their home or talks a lot about their astral body, these kind of things. And no doubt if you live in a big city, you will probably have a store, which would be considered a metaphysical store, but they will sell a lot of New Age trinkets. Now, I'm not bringing this up to try and disparage people if they consider themselves New Age. I really don't have a problem with it whatsoever. If it helps you, perfect, all well and good. But for some reason, a lot of occultists and magicians, they really do not like the New Age. They find a lot of it very appropriative. They find that the practices themselves and maybe even like the history of what they're promulgating to be, at best, dubious. As far as I can tell, and several others that look at the history of what one would call alternate spiritualities or the occult, I would say that when we squint and look back into history, a lot of the New Age ideas came from Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, as well as the Theosophists. So we'll be looking at something that is basically less than 150 years old. Theosophy really kind of hit its peak the late 19th century, early 20th century, and it was a worldwide phenomenon, right? So a lot of these ideas were all across the Western world. I say all of this because I was wondering in the preparation for this episode, where does New Age stop and occult and magic begin? Are there aspects that both share? Because I'm fairly certain there are. I mean, I do a lot of things that I'm sure would be considered New Age, but there's this fear and hesitancy for a lot of people to consider what they do to be part of New Age itself. And yet, in discussions of New Age, one person is usually never brought up. And this is a person who I feel, although they would probably not consider themselves New Age, certainly exemplifies a large part of this question as to the distinctions between New Age and magic. If there are lines between New Age and magic, they are incredibly blurry. And you know me, I am a huge fan of looking at these blurry or unfocused parts, not just of the history of magic and the occult, but the practices themselves. Where the lines blur, much can be learned, even if at the outset, perhaps maybe the lines aren't as distinct as one first thought. The occult and the esoteric and magic in the 20th century had many mystics, almost too many mystics, but few monoliths. Today's episode, I will be talking about both, a mystic and a monolith. So my name is Douglas Batchelor, and welcome to What Magic Is This Podcast, a podcast about magic, the occult, the esoteric, the paranormal, the supernatural, and the weird, as we step inside the Fool's Gallery to have a look at Manly Palmer Hall and the secret teachings of all ages. Now, a lot of people would probably poo-poo me for saying that Manly Palmer Hall situates a bit more on the New Age side of the equation, more so than the esoteric or the occult side. And I just want to reiterate that I personally do not have too much of a problem with New Age and New Age beliefs. There are a lot of very earnest people that are working in New Age and then consider themselves New Age. They completely own it, and that is perfectly fine. Some will say yes. I know that a lot of what I'm doing is more mythological and comes from a place that perhaps is not historically valid, but even still, I enjoy working with myths. I think the myths of certain parts of my practice are more important than factual parts of my practice, and I'm just going to go with it. Yes, I know that Atlantis was probably not a real place, but I find that the myth of Atlantis is still pretty cool. I get some kind of philosophical validity from even considering the philosophic implications of Atlantis itself. And I would agree. I would say that myths are wonderful, and we can learn quite a bit from them. Again, blurry lines. Where does myth stop and factual history begin? Are they as distinct as we'd like to think? It's a wonderful playground in which one can play as long as one does not mistake their myths for factual history. Without myths, a lot of the things like ancient mystery traditions would not exist. Sometimes they are far more inspirational than going through history. In some cases, for sure, there's almost more meat on the bones of myth than there is when one looks at what is, at this point in time, considered factual history. The fabric of our lives are indeed woven with the very threads of myth and philosophy and esotericism, even more so than most people would like to think. Without myths and without stories, we can barely call ourselves human, and one certainly couldn't call themselves a magician or an occultist. And so for us, and especially for people who are new seekers to this strange world that has been my home for so long, we are constantly looking for things to guide us in some way, and perhaps to even give us some answers. We know we don't fit in, and we know that the history that has been told to us and the paradigms by which our lives are governed perhaps aren't correct. So we look for people, and we look for books, which has basically been the way that many people within the West, particularly the Western esoteric tradition, has used to navigate. Manly Palmer Hall seems to be somebody that, at the outset of beginning one's journey to the Temple of Magic, that they very well might come across. After Aleister Crowley, the second most requested person that I have been sent emails or direct messages to cover has been Manly Palmer Hall. And so what began as an episode in which I was going to basically just go through a regular Fool's Gallery episode, it's like, I think I know enough about Manly Palmer Hall, slowly evolved into probably my most researched episode of What Magic Is This that I have ever done. I've gone through more than 3 books in an effort to try and get the gist of what Manly Palmer Hall was about. I didn't realize how little I knew about Manly Palmer Hall until I was confronted with it. And what emerged was still somewhat blurry. I am not sure that I have a better picture of Manly Palmer Hall than when I started. But I think that now I can see that Manly Palmer Hall is indeed, as Brandon Wilson found in his essay, that Manly Palmer Hall is indeed one of the forgotten fathers of the New Age. Although I'm sure that were Manly Palmer Hall around today, he certainly wouldn't agree. First and foremost, before I get into the details of the episode, I really want people to understand this idea of a mystic. Somebody who is an enigma of their times, but who cannot help themselves for constantly seeking new philosophies and new ideas and promulgating them for others. We live in a very different time than Manly Palmer Hall lived, and at the outset, at least in Manly Palmer Hall's early adulthood, metaphysical figures were chock-a-block. There were so many of them. And in some way, this was distressing to Manly Palmer Hall for some reason. In a way, Manly felt the way that a lot of occultists and magicians feel now when they look at New Age. And so Manly, being the mystic that he was, seemingly wanted to blow away all of the cobwebs of these figures who, in Manly's eyes, merely wanted other people's money and weren't in it for the journey and the seeking of esoteric truth. It was a task that nobody gave to him, but one which he took with so much vigor and effort that it is, from any angle that I've tried to look at it, nothing but admirable. The mere fact that Manly Palmer Hall's efforts are as alive and as popular today as they are is a testament to this one man's search, to his seeking. But what of Manly Palmer Hall himself? Like any good mystic, a lot of the details of Manly Palmer Hall and what he was like are to this day somewhat enigmatic. There is a rather brilliant, I found, biography of Manly Palmer Hall available called Master of the Mysteries, The Life of Manly Palmer Hall by Louis Sagan, which I enjoyed far more than I was expecting. So at this point in time, that really would be the best place to look if you actually want to see a bit more about the life of Manly Palmer Hall. Again, this incredibly enigmatic man. Manly Palmer Hall was born in 1901 in Peterborough, Ontario, Canada. That's right. Manly is a Canadian, like myself. Peterborough is about a 1 hour's traveling time from where I am currently situated here in Toronto, Ontario, for those of you who want to know the geography of some places. At the time, the turn of the 20th century, Peterborough would have been a somewhat small place, a lot of agriculture, a bit of industry, a lot of farms around the area. So Manly certainly came from somewhat humble beginnings, but also with a bit of a esoteric foundation, as Manly's mother, Louise Palmer Hall, was a chiropractor as well as a member of an organization called the Rosicrucian Fellowship. I'm just going to divert here for a second for those people who are unaware of what Rosicrucians were or the idea of Rosicrucianism. One can think of them maybe as a joke, perhaps, or a bit of a prank that got taken very seriously. It was early 17th century in which these pamphlets would have been released, these publications in which they would talk about a mystical esoteric order called the Rosicrucians that were trying to spread knowledge and what we would normally say would be some kind of a humanist message. A lot of people took it very, very seriously, and it is a bit of a misnomer to say that Rosicrucians never existed, but it was one of those things where anybody could call themselves a Rosicrucian and it would just be so. By the mid-19th century, both in England and in America, but sometimes even before that in places like Germany, there would be these organizations that would say that they were part of this Rosicrucian fellowship, that they were part of this lineage of ancient esoteric knowledge. And at the end of the 19th century, along with things like Freemasons, there would be organizations that would claim to be Rosicrucian. And Manly Palmer Hall's mother, Louise, was a member of one of these organizations. So it was right there at the beginning of Manly Palmer Hall's life. By all accounts, Louise was a formidable woman, very strong, very progressive for her time, and especially in what would be considered a very Victorian part of Canada. As for Manly's father, he was basically a waste of space. He was one of those people that nobody could rely on, and he disappeared shortly after Manly Palmer Hall was born. And so Louise took to raising Manly by herself, which was a bit too much for the time. And Louise was somewhat overwhelmed with her responsibilities. And so Manly was sent to the American West to live with his maternal grandmother, whose husband had been a fire insurance salesman. Ah, the good old days. While living with his grandmother, Manly had a somewhat transitory life. They would spend a lot of time in the Midwest, as well as in North and South Dakota. They were seemingly always on the move, and this made things a little bit difficult for Manly, particularly when it came to education and to schooling. Manly was also sick quite a bit, and so he would spend a lot of time in bed recovering from his many illnesses. And so he was given plenty of books to read, and this was how Manly was educated. Grandma certainly helped as much as she could, but Manly was basically the one who taught himself everything. Which, in a way, I'm sure it has its upsides. It was certainly a bit more common back in the day, if there was any kind of education at all. But the downside to this is that Manly Palmer Hall, in his adolescence, lived a very, very lonely life. He did not have a lot of friends. There is talk that he had some friends, but again, as they were going all over the place, a lot of the times these friendships wouldn't last too long. Some people have made a lot of the fact that Manly lived in somewhat lonely circumstances, and I do really think that this definitely is something about his personality and might have very much added to his need to be recognized in some way for something. This is in some way, I think, an aspect of Manly Palmer Hall that many of us, myself included, can certainly identify with. Another thing that I can identify with, at least, is that when the opportunity arose, Manly's grandmother would try to take Manly to museums as they were traveling around, particularly in Chicago and in New York and in Philadelphia. And from what we can tell, this was his favorite thing, was to go to these places and see these old artifacts and to imagine a past that he could in some way tangibly feel more of a part of than the time that he was living. One thing that really comes off when you start to look at the life of Manly Palmer Hall is that he always seemed to be reaching back into the past. He seemed like a man out of time, which is something fairly familiar that you will find when you look into mystics and other esoteric figures. They're not quite in the right place as far as time. A lot of mystics feel out of joint, in some way askew. And for many of them, they feel like they are part of a past knowledge or paradigm or way of being with the world. They don't fit in very well in the time that they are alive. A major event in the life of Manly was the death of his grandmother when he was 16, which was quite devastating. But this allowed for Manly to head to Southern California and reunite with his mother, who was living there. Now, we all have this idea of Southern California as being densely populated and fairly modern. The early 20th century, Southern California was still a developing place. It was definitely on its way to becoming the place that we know now. And for Manly, I think he certainly sensed this potentiality of the place because he also saw in the area that a lot of mystical people and esoteric orders were beginning to come up when Manly arrived. California would basically be the home of Manly Palmer Hall for the rest of his life. It fed him and nourished him. He loved everything about it. Something happened to Manly when he arrived in California and in the years after, in which his interest in the esoteric and ancient mysteries was in some way giving him life and giving him a confidence that up to this point he did not have. He became very interested in the Theosophical Society, and he would spend a lot of time in one of the Theosophical libraries in Southern California. And ever the autodidact, he would try to read and absorb as much as possible. He is at the age where everything is very influential to him, and he is just soaking it all up. The Theosophists would become a huge thing in Manly's life, particularly with their ideas, a lot of which Manly certainly drew from. I read a somewhat cynical criticism of Manly Palmer Hall in which the author of this criticism said that Manly took all of the words of Blavatsky at face value and didn't question any of it. I think that that is an overly cynical take, but Manly certainly did take some cues from Blavatsky and from Theosophy. I'm pretty sure that Manly's upbringing, in which he was fairly sick, but then had to teach himself a lot of his own knowledge, this in a way added to a slow burning but still present self-confidence that allowed him to basically take the steps to public speaking. He would actually hold talks in which he would cover such things as reincarnation, which gathered some listeners, and he would continue to do this. And with each and every lecture, seemingly, he became more and more popular and became more and more confident. And he eventually, at the age of 20, and this is fairly young. I mean, back in the day, people did live a little faster than we do now, but he was 20 years old when he became a pastor at an evangelical church called the Church of the People. And it is here where he continued to hone his craft of talking about spiritual concepts. And he must have been very, very popular because he found a lot of support, including financial support. I mean, imagine being 20 to 21 years old and having people give you money to put on talks around Southern California at the time. And he must have been very, very successful at this because he was able to garner enough attention and gain enough monetary support to be able to travel. He traveled around the world, no doubt adding some cred to his mysterious and enigmatic personality. Now, around this time, Manly was mainly known as being a public speaker. Yet this was not enough for him. He wanted to write. He wanted to have something tangible. Words said in an auditorium only go so far. He wanted to have his thoughts and his ideas and the knowledge that he had learned put on paper. And so at the age of 21, he published his first work. It was called The Initiates of the Flame, which is a book that goes through a lot of symbols, things that are fairly familiar to those of us within the occult, things like the pentagram, things like obelisks, the all-seeing eye, that kind of stuff. And later editions of the book were illustrated with these really wonderful illustrations by J. Augustus Knapp. I want to just pause for a little bit here and talk about this book because to us now, looking back at it, it seems fairly run-of-the-mill. It seems very ordered. There'd be some words, and then there's this illustration, and then he just goes on about these symbols. But at the time, it was an incredibly, I'm going to say, original work, and it would definitely be a work that would later come to even further focus with his later publishing of his monolith, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. Not wanting to sit on his laurels in any way, shape, or form, he also published a book called The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, which a lot of people actually get this wrong. A lot of people think that Manly Palmer Hall was a Freemason right from the get-go, but he actually published this book before he was even a Freemason. He was just going off of, he's going off of some interesting sources like Albert Pike, who not sure if I'll do an episode on him or not, but kind of strange stuff. But Manly didn't become a Freemason until 1954, and he rose up the ranks fairly quickly. Yet these two books were, in a way, almost like Manly and his public speaking. This started very small and then eventually grew into something a little bit larger. And yet in these two books, you can see that Manly is, in a way, building upon this idea of myths and being able to tell a story in a mythical way, particularly the Lost Keys of Freemasonry. It reads like it comes from an authority and a master storyteller as well. Compared to a lot of the sludge that was being produced at the time, Manly's writing was a cut above everything else. Manly would continue to lecture, but for the next 5 years after the publishing of The Lost Keys of Freemasonry, Manly devoted all of his attention towards the researching and writing of the book that he is known for. And this will be published in 1928 as The Secret Teachings of All Ages. It was a massive book, and I don't just mean that by page numbers. The thing was enormous. Copies of it would sell for, back in the day, between $100 and $150. It was huge and illustrated. And the way in which Manly had this book made and made available to people was via a subscription service. You subscribe and then you'd get this book and you'd continue to pay for it. But it is an astounding document, and certainly made even more astounding by the fact that he was 27 years old when it was published. And I know a lot of people make a lot of this, and it is certainly one of those things where I can't even remember what I was doing at 27 years old. That Manly took that 5 years and was able to write this book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, by the age of 27, is astounding. I will be circling back to this book in some time, but I just like to continue the story of Manly's life. 2 years after the publication of The Secret Teachings of All Ages, Manly Palmer Hall got married for the first time to his secretary, of all things, Faye de Ravine. There is very little known about Faye. By all accounts, the marriage was not a very happy one, and I don't know how much Manly added to this, but Faye was certainly jealous of Manly Palmer Hall's success. There's been some people that have said that we might need to re-examine just how much Faye helped Manly with writing The Secret Teachings of All Ages. I mean, she was his secretary, and she was also an astrologer. So there was that as well. But by all accounts, Faye was a deeply unhappy person. She was very sullen. She would go to some of Manly's lectures, and there are stories of her being very sullen and looking very miserable while Manly is on stage giving his talk. There's pictures of both Manly and Faye was an incredibly attractive woman. Even to today, she would be considered extremely attractive. But all of Manly's friends that knew Faye said that she was a deeply troubled woman and that she was prone to mood swings. And Manly himself was a very busy man. He liked to keep himself busy, always lecturing, continuing writing. And some say that he was probably exacerbating a lot of Faye's mental illnesses by basically ignoring her needs. After 11 years of a tumultuous marriage, Faye got into her car outside of where the Halls were living and attached a garden hose to the exhaust pipe of their car, let it in through the window, filled her car up with the exhaust, and committed suicide. She left a suicide note to her mother, basically saying that the pain of life was larger than the fear of death. It was, however, while Manly was married to Faye that several things happened in his life. In 1934, he set up the Philosophical Research Society in California, which was a non-profit research organization which was set to promulgate philosophic and esoteric teachings, which is still around to this day. If you're ever in Los Angeles, definitely pay it a visit. It's an interesting building. As mentioned several times, Manly was in Southern California for a lot of this Los Angeles, and he tried as much as he could to stay away from Hollywood and film culture, although he was friends for a time with Bela Lugosi. I believe Bela Lugosi's last marriage, the wedding took place in Manly Palmer Hall's home. But one foray into the world of film did occur, and that was in 1938 with Manly Palmer Hall writing a movie called When Were You Born?, which is a bit of a murder mystery that centers around the zodiac and astrological signs. For research purposes, I took it upon myself to watch this film, and it is terrible. It is very, very tedious. But watch the first 10 minutes because you can actually see Manly Palmer Hall in all of his glory, giving a little bit of a speech about astrology. It's actually kind of cool, but after that first 10 minutes, things get very, very tiresome. In 1944, Manly published another book called The Secret Destiny of America, which is a fairly interesting book. I don't want to spend too much time talking about it. Definitely seek it out if the kind of thing is interesting to you. But apparently, one of its biggest fans was the Teflon president himself, Ronald Reagan, who some have surmised actually visited Manly Palmer Hall a few times. In 1950, Manly married his second wife, Marie Bauer, who it's tough to say because some people would categorize her as a force of nature, very protective of Manly, and certainly one of those people that you would not want to cross. By all accounts, the marriage and relationship was a little bit fraught. Some people have surmised that Manly never consummated his marriage with Marie. Manly was an extremely private person, and Marie was as well, and so they would really try to crack down on any kind of gossip that surrounded Manly. The man lived an extremely private life, and I can certainly respect that. The two words that seem to come up when people discuss Manly Palmer's second wife, Marie, is eccentric and erratic, and she will play a part a little bit further on down the line. The next 4 decades of Manly Palmer Hall's life, from 1950 to 1990, is fairly banal. It seems that Manly mainly got himself into a bit of a groove. He liked routine. He would produce thousands and thousands of lectures. He would continue writing just hundreds of pamphlets that would be available through the PRS. California would always be his home, but he would travel and do some talks. But he was, for all intents and purposes, just living that 20th century mystical life, keeping to himself for the most part. In 1973, Manly Palmer Hall was recognized as a 33-degree Mason, which is, of course, the highest degree, this being 47 years after he wrote a book about Freemasonry. In the 1980s, 2 people, a father and a son, involved themselves with Manly Palmer Hall's affairs, and things got very ugly very quickly. And I will return to this in a little bit of time. But at the age of 89, the old mystic Manly Palmer Hall died in 1990. And so these are the circumstances and details of the life of Manly P. Hall. That was the what of Manly Palmer Hall. I'd like to take a bit of time now to talk about the how of Manly Palmer Hall. One of the first things that people will say, particularly those who knew Manly, was his physical appearance. He cut an incredibly striking figure. He was very, very tall. He had these chiseled looks. And if you see a picture of Manly Palmer Hall, particularly between the age of 20 and 40, he is a very striking and, I will say, attractive man with long, dark hair, which he would have pulled back, and sometimes with a very thin mustache. He certainly looks like he would be at home being a villain in one of those 1930 horror movies. And while people do talk about the fact that he cut a very imposing figure, many people also mention just how quiet and somewhat shy and very kind he was to everybody. I mean, you can take the boy out of Canada, but you can't take the Canada out of the boy. His upbringing, and particularly his education, meant that he just wanted to do everything himself. And this is a very admirable trait that I find from Manly Palmer Hall. He had a lust for knowledge that was unquenchable, and he just wanted to know absolutely everything about anything that interested him. This also fed into a work ethic that we see with a lot of mystical figures, just like Aleister Crowley, just this puritanical work ethic. And as I said, there are thousands of his lectures. All of them were recorded, and he would always be writing these pamphlets about anything that interested him. But there is something that goes along, at least in my reading of his biography, that Manly in a way knew that he had peaked with the secret teachings of all ages. And from 1950 to his death in 1990, although he did have this routine, he was always just this guy who wanted to be recognized, again, speaking to his loneliness as a child. It's gotta suck to know that your best work is always behind you. And even though the Secret Teachings of All Ages wasn't immensely popular and didn't become more popular until the 90s and the 2000s, the gravity that that book had on his life, in a way, I think, depressed him a little bit. He gained quite a considerable amount of weight through the 70s and the 80s. And there are not a ton of photographs of him at this time. As far as what he believed, I would say that his values were fairly conservative, and they remained that way throughout his life. He liked the idea of the golden rule, things like family values, being kind to people, that sort of thing. But above all of this, Manly was a seeker. He was very curious. He wanted to know more, and he wanted to share it in some way. There are some who think that Manly possessed an incredible memory. The word photographic memory has been brought up. There are tales of people just saying, Manly, do you want to talk today about something? And they'd set up a microphone, and then there'd be a group of people, and he would be able to talk for 4 hours straight, a very measured pace, but just being able to draw connections to things and bring things in and just talk. He thought that philosophy was important and that it was part of the breadth of what makes us human, this need to know why. Modern life has somehow lost its way being able to ask these questions, and indeed, the asking of this question itself provides a lot of people with a lot of anxiety. And Manly wanted to make this not so hard for people, to know that it is okay to look back into the past and bring some of those esoteric and philosophical ideas into your life to perhaps help in some way. I think it can be said that Manly just lived a mystic's life. And this life would not have been the life that we know were it not for his publication of the book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages. The 20th century has not been flush with books that I can say are completely monolithic, or even the occult and magic for that matter. Something like Agrippa's 3 books of occult philosophy would certainly be one of them, but I think in the top 5, certainly for people, The Secret Teachings of All Ages is there. It is an incredibly intimidating book, no matter which edition you have. It took Manly about 6 years to write this book. And again, it was published when he was 27 years old, self-published. There are stories of Manly spending hours and hours and hours in the New York Public Library at the large wooden tables that exist there, and him just getting book after book after book and making copious notes, not unlike Charles Fort. And then once the book was completed, to have the audacity to release a book that you just can't hold it in your hand. It is far too big for that, at least the first edition. And there was another edition, I believe, that was done in the 70s, which is also pretty large. No matter which book you have, and most likely you have the reader's edition, it looks like a magical book. There are these wonderful illustrations in there by J. Augustus Knapp. The book looks special. It feels special in your hands. How does it read? Well, it's not that difficult. It is a landslide of details, which seemingly covers almost everything that a lot of people would consider the Western esoteric tradition. And so, forgive me, but I'm literally now just going to go through in order what the book encompasses. Ancient mystery traditions, Atlantis, Hermeticism, ancient structures like the pyramids, the zodiac and astrology, the wonders of the world, including the Oracle of Delphi, Pythagoras and Pythagorean mathematics, the building of Solomon's Temple and masonry, flowers, plants, fruits, trees, stones, metals, gems, the elements, alchemy, the Kabbalah, tarot cards, ceremonial magic, Rosicrucianism, Shakespeare, symbols, mystic Christianity, and so much more. This book is all over the map, but for many people, this would be immediately recognizable as being the Western esoteric tradition, all here in one book. And as daunting as the book first appears, it is actually very easy to read. Manly does a very good job throughout the whole book at explaining what he is going through, particularly for somebody like me who is terrible at math. His chapters on Pythagoras are actually very good. I can actually get a handle on what he is trying to say. The book is dizzying in the places that it goes, but when one does read the book, they get a sense of the urgency that Manly Palmer Hall had, this idea that he felt somewhat disheartened with the state of esoteric and philosophical thought that existed when he was younger, and he just wanted to get every single piece of what he considered to be the esoteric tradition of the West in one place. It was his task, his boon, to be able to collect it and ultimately share it. I remember the very first time that I got a hold of Manly Palmer Hall's The Secret Teaching of All Ages, and it was one of those things that it sat for a long time on my nightstand before I even picked it up. It was just too intimidating to pick up. And so it sat there, and it was a library rental, but luckily I was the only one who really had any interest in reading it. When I finally cracked it open and started going through the whole thing, it felt like I was being led through this hall of esotericism. But don't mind the pun, that was totally unintentional. But anyways, that I was being given a curated experience to one man's esoteric philosophy, filtered and condensed so that it would be easy for somebody to be able to say, yes, it's all right to think differently. It's okay to be curious. The authority with which Manly writes is very palpable. So when you read his book, your first reaction is going to be, well, this is truth. Manly found the truth. Manly did the work, so I don't have to. In anticipation of doing this episode, I was trying to find anybody who was in any way critical of the secret teachings of all ages. And it was very hard to. I think this could be down to several things. One, the amount of stuff in this book makes it so monolithic in scale that if one was to try and do a chapter by chapter analysis of what is speculative as opposed to what is in some way factual, is going to be as much work as it would have taken Manly to compose the book in the first place. This is not a fault of Manly Palmer Hall in any way, shape, or form. Going madly off in all directions is exhilarating. And the way in which Manly writes is some of the best mystical writing that you will ever come across. Going along with the writing, of course, you have these illustrations that are just fantastic. If you want to produce a book that looks magical, the template was pretty much single-handedly created with Manly Palmer Hall's The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And this is one thing that I don't think I've seen very much from very many people that really love and appreciate Manly Palmer Hall's work, is that the actual composition of the book and the way that the book looks, particularly the first edition, the way that it is laid out is beyond brilliant. I think some chapters would be better put in other places, but that's just nitpicking. Remembering my very first read of it, it almost seemed like some gem, some golden nugget existed and would be available to you with every turn of the page. And if the words aren't going to grab you, the illustrations by J. Augustus Knapp certainly will. I would look at some of these illustrations for minutes. They're so good. Truthfully, and I hope this doesn't sound cynical, but I actually truly think that the combination of words and images from the Secret Teachings of All Ages is actually its greatest legacy. Unfortunately, I do not have time to go through every little bit of the book. That would be too much, but I'm just going to go through some of the things that I really did like, and then I'll go through some of the things that I'm not too keen about. So as mentioned, I think the chapters on Pythagoras are pretty good. Mind you, I'm not overly interested in Pythagoras, so I'm not too sure how much of that is speculative and how much of it is true and in line with what Pythagoras was trying to promulgate. But it is still fairly easy to read and fairly easy to wrap your head around. I quite enjoy how he writes about the wonders of the ancient world. I think that is definitely worth a read. I remember being somewhat moved by the short little blurb that he has about Dionysiac architects. Even though a lot of that is very speculative, I still think it's a fairly cool idea. But more than anything, I think that just the enthusiasm within the writing, the urgency in which Manly Palmer Hall is trying to get all of these ideas into your head and in some ways connecting them and pointing at them. And just in a way, as I said earlier, is that you're taken on a trip to the museum that is Manly Palmer Hall's enthusiasm for esoteric knowledge and the seeking of it. Indeed, the vastness of the book is in some way its greatest power and also in a way almost its Achilles heel. There's just so much information. For those interested who might need a little bit of a hand, Mitch Horowitz has a book called The Seeker's Guide to the Secret Teachings of All Ages. Now, Mitch Horowitz loves Manly Palmer Hall. He has a huge amount of respect for the man as well as the work. It is an interesting book. I will say this, he tends to concentrate not so much on the contents of the book, but almost the lessons that one can learn that are skirting around the periphery of the book. He goes into things like Hermeticism and the Kabbalah. It's not a skeleton key to try and understand the book better, but just being able to look at a lot of what Manly Palmer Hall was trying to say. And then that is brought in through Mitch's studies and his journey as well. So it's a bit of a worthy companion. He doesn't so much as defend a lot of the more speculative aspects of Manly Palmer Hall's work within The Secret Teachings of All Ages, but in a way just tries to reframe it for a somewhat modern reader. And in a way to try and showcase the virtues of Manly Palmer Hall and why this quest and this seeking of esoteric and philosophical truths is indeed a very worthy thing. Now, some of the things that I am not too enamored with when I talk specifically about The Secret Teachings of All Ages is much of it is speculative. Manly only had the tools available to him at the time, and we have to understand that it was this knowledge being filtered through Manly Palmer Hall and where he was at that time in the 1920s. And so my problems with this book speaks back to how I opened this episode and some of the more new age aspects of the book. The book doesn't really have one main thesis. I mean, people might argue with me on that one, but one of the major points that the book tries to make is this whole stuff about Atlantis, as well as an unbroken chain of knowledge which has been passed down through secret societies through time, and even the mysteries being part of this whole process as well. Now, this is not exclusive to Manly Palmer Hall by any stretch of the imagination, and it is not only exclusive to The Secret Teachings of All Ages. He's talked about this in other books as well. We enter very murky water when we try to say that secret societies and these ancient mysteries are an unbroken line. And through, say, something like Mark Booth's The Secret History of the World as laid down by the secret societies, when we try to investigate these kind of things, we can only stay in the realm of speculation. Truthfully, the best that we have is a maybe. Now, some of Manly's sources are not the best. People like Albert Pike and the Theosophists. For me, and this is something that I talk about a lot in my Patreon episodes, I do think that magic is a real and tangible thing. And so maybe is just not enough for me. I'd like to stick to the things that I know and I can look back and point to and say that this was actually there. For me, the Western magical and esoteric tradition has more in line with things like cunning folk, less so to do with things like secret societies and the Rosicrucians, which is a gripe that I also have with things like what I call gift shop magic. A lot of the more speculative aspects of The Secret Teachings of All Ages read to me more like myths, which is not to say that we can't learn things from them. We like things like the story of Christian Rosenkreutz and the Rosicrucians because they're fun. They're not telling the truth, but there is a sort of truth in them. And so while Manly Palmer Hall took it upon himself to try and set things right in the world that he lived in with a lot of this very spurious mystical figures and strange knowledge from all over the place, he was one of those ones who's like, I want to get things right for everybody. And unfortunately, it doesn't really pass muster now. Manly had the best that was available to him at the time. Our knowledge has since moved on, and particularly with his understandings of the mystery traditions, there's been a lot of research done recently and a lot of socioeconomic aspects to these traditions that Manly doesn't even touch on. He was trying his best. He was trying to do the best with what he had. The thing is that if one was to take each and every detail in The Secret Teachings of All Ages, I don't want to put a percentage on it, but I would say that he hits the mark for most of these things, at least in an introductory way. He hits the mark at least 80% of the time. The 20% of the stuff that is complete speculation, it's very dated, and particularly his view of these ancient mysteries being kept, the flame of them being kept alive by secret societies like the Rosicrucians. It's a little bit painful. So for me, as an operant and practical magician, stuff like his chapter on ceremonial magic, which is basically ripped from Eliphas Levi, is terrible. His chapter on the tarot is very of its time. It is so tethered to the time that Manly was in the 1920s that it's hurting. And so my history of the Western magical tradition is far different than that of Manly Palmer Hall's, which I think is more mystical and more mythical than anything else. They remain a very powerful story, and it is a story that a ton of people have taken as being objective truth. And when you do any search on YouTube or anything like that, a lot of times Manly Palmer Hall will be put up as being the objective truth, and it's just not so. And so you get a lot of the really bad takes that I'm sure if Manly Palmer Hall was alive right now, he himself would probably say, I think you need to do a little bit better work. This really isn't where it's supposed to be. Using Manly Palmer Hall and the secret teachings of all ages as a source, particularly for practical magic, it does not hold any water anymore. The vastness and the monolithic nature of the secret teachings of all ages does not make it impenetrable and immune to criticism. It is, and this needs to be understood by everybody who wishes to read this book, it is a product of its time that is painfully tethered to its sources. Much of those sources are saying very speculative things. The youthful exuberance with which the secret teachings of all ages are, in a way, the key to understanding Manly Palmer Hall. In a way, that is the reason that Manly is certainly a titan of magic in this fool's gallery. Because not unlike another figure like John Dee, his willingness to take a lot of things at face value also impacted his life in a very terrible way. It's good to be open-minded, and it is good to be enthusiastic about everything, particularly when you are treading into the waters of the esoteric. But you can also find yourself out to sea, adrift, and grasping at anything that might show you the way. This is exemplified in the last 10 years of Manly Palmer Hall's life. Two people, a father and a son. The name of the father was Daniel Fritz, somehow involved themselves in Manly's affairs. By all accounts, this person was very convincing to Manly and basically got Manly to handle almost every aspect of his life. In the 80s, as I mentioned, Manly was fairly overweight. One thing that this duo did for Manly was that they got him to lose quite a bit of weight, but they were also promising him things. They promised him that they would be able to share his lectures via satellite. They were basically telling him that the thing that he always wanted, this recognition, that they could give it to him and that they would be the ones that would be able to deliver on this promise. And Manly, he took them at their word, and he basically allowed them to control every aspect of his life. One of the more distressing things in my research for this episode was the description of Manly Palmer Hall being found dead. And this is from the biography that I mentioned earlier, Master of the Mysteries. In the lead up to Manly passing away, a lot of things happened with the PRS. They were in great financial difficulties. Manly basically handed over all aspects and all of the books to this two-person duo. 2 days before he passed away, Manly signed over his will and bequeathed all of his antiques and collectibles to these people. It was all very, very fishy. And when Manly Palmer Hall was found dead, he was in a bed, and somebody noticed that Manly was covered in ants. Ants were crawling in and out from his eyes, from his mouth, from his ears, and his nose. By all accounts, it was a horrific scene. This led to a great amount of speculation about the death of Manly Palmer Hall. Most of it was being put forward by his widow, who was fairly certain that Manly was murdered. There are a lot of details surrounding the last couple of weeks of Manly Palmer Hall's life, which are very suspicious. And it's one of those things that is actually quite tragic. From my understanding of Manly himself, he was a very kind person, as I mentioned earlier, very trustworthy, and it is such a shame that the last few years of his life were as hard as they were, and that he allowed himself to be taken advantage of so easily. I really can't speculate myself as to whether or not I think if Manly was killed or allowed to die. All I can say is that the last few months of his life were probably filled with a lot of terror and uncertainty and confusion. And the fallout from Manly's death, and with these two individuals who are also dead as of now, is just so American. And I'm saying that just in the sense that lawyers and courts had to be involved, and there's bankruptcies, and it got very, very ugly. And Manly himself would have certainly thought the whole thing to be grotesque and atrocious. All I can say is Manly deserved better. But there is certainly a lesson here, and it is the same lesson that is told through somebody like John Dee, which is you can be the greatest occultist, the greatest scholar, the smartest person in every room you walk into, and yet you can also be utterly and stupidly blinded by other figures and other ideas to a shamefully deleterious degree. There is a reason it is called the Fool's Gallery. So how should we see this book, The Secret Teachings of All Ages, now? Do I think it is a book that people should read, particularly if you are new to magic and the occult? I would say no. Again, it is very tethered to when it was written. There's certainly some interesting stuff in there, but research and our understandings of the things that are being covered in The Secret Teachings of All Ages have been covered better elsewhere. That being said, if you can find a copy of The Secret Teachings of All Ages from the Philosophical Research Society, the one with all of the illustrations, that might be worthy of having. Again, I think it is a beautiful book to flip through, and there's no other way I can say it. It's a gorgeous book. It's really quite fantastic. Oh man, this is a little bit unprofessional. You know what? Maybe it should be read. I mean, it's a fun book. I love the way that Manly writes. It's very easy to understand. In some ways, he says some very beautiful things. The way he tries to tie this world together is pretty fun. I'll just say this. If you want to experience the early 20th century understandings of Western esoteric thought as a curated museum experience in book form, definitely give The Secret Teachings of All Ages a read. It is a big book, but it's fun if the myth of the Western magical esoteric tradition is your idea of fun. And it's certainly inspiring. I will definitely say that. It's quite inspiring. But the second you use some of the things in there, such as Atlantis and some of the secret society stuff, as a source to prove your point, I would say you've lost the point of the book. It is part of the fuel of the Western esoteric tradition's fire. It is not the fire itself. These days, when people ask me for more information about something in line with the Western esoteric tradition, I would be more than willing to suggest the book, The Secret Teachers of the Western World by Gary Lockman. It is a fantastic book. It is wonderful to read. It's certainly more contemporary with more contemporary sources than The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And it also visits some of the same places that Manly Palmer Hall visits in The Secret Teachings of All Ages. And if the secret society stuff is interesting to you, the book that I mentioned a little bit earlier by Mark Booth, The Secret History of the World as Laid Down by the Secret Societies. And I'd also recommend perhaps the work of Tobias Churton, specifically his book on Rosicrucianism and the Rosicrucians. But if you read Gary Lockman's book, The Secret Teachers of the Western World, you're pretty much set. Plenty of other places to go just from reading that book. As for Manly Palmer Hall himself, well, all I can say is that I really admire the guy. I think his heart was in the right place for a lot of this. I didn't expect with the outset of this episode that I would read as much about him as I did. And even though a lot of his life is not known and he was a very private person, he comes off as very relatable. Yet again, he's another one of those figures who, although I don't really agree with a lot of their work, I would probably really like them. I mean, not to turn this to me, but he reminds me a lot of myself. Very private, somewhat soft-spoken, some interesting ideas, wants to understand more and to surround themselves with their journey and their seeking to know more. He's certainly more philosophical than I am, but his quest to try and understand the past and history and how all of that is tied in somehow with a fall that we have had since the 19th century is indeed something that I find very admirable. And his penchant to want to share everything that he has learned, well, that's the thing. Those are the people that I love. Manly Palmer Hall, Gary Lockman, Colin Wilson, Charles Fort. These are my people. The people whose private lives are somewhat occulted, but whose passions are public. One of my favorite things that I read about Manly Palmer Hall was about death. And he said, "Don't try and contact me after I'm dead, I'll probably be very, very busy. That's awesome. And while I've never been overly influenced by Manly Palmer Hall, I do see a lot of things that's worth liking about the guy. As mentioned, looking towards the past and the spiritualities and mysteries that existed there. But I want to make it very plainly clear for everybody. You will not find the answers in the past, but please keep the curiosity. That is the greatest lesson that you can learn from Manly Palmer Hall. And yet things have changed since he was in his prime, which came very early to him. And so now we can look back and basically say, this take was very odd. I'm not sure why he's talking about Atlantis. That blurring between the New Age and occultism is where you need to head. And so if you do read The Secret Teachings of All Ages, just be aware of where these instances pop up, because there you can see the power of these interesting myths. And if you're able to read the work of Manly Palmer Hall, and you yourself are able to sift the gold from the grit, that is a very useful tool to have. And in a way, it could very well be a litmus test for your seeking and your journey going forward. We have much better sources than Manly Palmer Hall had at his time. Our understandings are far greater. And if you are listening to this episode with a bit of despair, because The Secret Teachings of All Ages has been your book, I say fear not, because we do have people that are around right now that are saying similar things in a different way, with better detail and less speculation. In fact, I would say that we have at our disposal right now one person who might, in a way, blush at the suggestion of being compared to Manly Palmer Hall, but bear with me for a second. Their name is Dan Attrell. Dan is a Canadian. In fact, he is in Waterloo, Ontario, which is about a 2-hour drive away from Peterborough, Ontario. So that's a bit of a connection that I just couldn't keep to myself. I love it. But Dan makes videos that he releases, and he touches on a lot of the philosophic areas that Manly Palmer Hall does. Dan has a lot of great videos where he will go through and explain these highly complex philosophies and areas of esotericism that are quite breathtaking. So in some way, I think that Manly Palmer Hall himself would be a fan of the modern hermeticist Dan Attrell. It is very, very worthy. We have in our mind this idea that monoliths last, that they are there and will remain there for all of time. But we also know, when we take a second to think about it, that this is untrue. Some people, as well as their work, is only there for a time, particularly when they are built on shaky foundations. As I made my way through the research in this episode, 2 places keep coming to my mind, and those are museums and libraries. Museums for the place that Manly Palmer Hall's grandmother would take him when he was younger and hungry for knowledge. And libraries, which is where Manly spent days and hours of his time creating the book that he would be known for, to create his monolith that would steer him to the path of being a unique voice, of being a mystic. But the great work isn't done in these places. It's not done in the museums. It's not done in the libraries. Manly Palmer Hall knew this, and so should you. So that's the episode, everybody. Please check out the show notes. There's going to be some really interesting links there, as well as a lot of the books that I mentioned that weren't written by Manly Palmer Hall, things from Gary Lockman and Tobias Churton and Mark Booth. Please check those out. Those are available at whatmagicisthis.com. Also on whatmagicisthis.com, you can find a link to my Twitter account, my Facebook account, as well as my Instagram account. I am on Twitter quite a bit, although these days I've been very, very busy. I'm still around. It's just there's a lot of things to do. As far as Instagram and Facebook, I'm not on those a ton, but there you go. Reasons. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend, and then hopefully they tell a friend, and then they tell a friend, and that's how word of mouth happens, and that's the best way of sharing your love for What Magic Is This. And if you do like the show, please leave a review on iTunes or any place that you can leave a review. It would be greatly appreciated. People do read those. Do you think that I'm doing something important, or you just want to show your support for the show? I have a few ways in which you can do this. The first and best way of doing this is joining my Patreon. That is patreon.com/whatmagicisthis, or head to whatmagicisthis.com and click on any one of the Patreon links there. They're all over the place. I have but one tier. So it's one of those things where you either support the show or you do not. It is $7 American a month. That gives you access to tons of things. I have a lot of exclusive content, including videos about how to make things like incense or how to do a fire cleanse. I do audio episodes about entities such as Hermanubis or saints like Saint Cyprian. I'll even do episodes about Goetia and grimoires, as well as going through some of my books that I think are fundamental to magic itself. And it also allows you to do a couple of things, like picking topics for upcoming shows of What Magic Is This. That's where the topics come from. Manly Palmer Hall was one of the topics that was voted on a few months ago, and it was right up at the top there. So it was the Patreon supporters that decided that they wanted to hear about Manly Palmer Hall, but pretty much most of the topics that I talk about on this podcast are chosen in a poll by the Patreon supporters. Patreon also gives you a chance to suggest topics for future polls, so that's pretty sweet as well. And you also get access to a private Patreon-only Discord account where we have some of my former guests on there, as well as a ton of magically operant people and some people that are just starting out. So it is a great and wonderful community. I can't say enough about it, but that is available at $7 a month. That is it. That is all I am asking. That is the best way of supporting what I do here on What Magic Is This. Another way of supporting is if you don't want to pay the whole $7 a month stuff, I have a PayPal me link all over What Magic Is This. Click that button. You can donate $5, $10, $20, any amount. It all goes to keeping the fires on here at What Magic Is This. I pay for internet hosting as well as podcast hosting, and all of those expenses are covered through every single one of the donations that I get through the PayPal. Any amount is appreciated, but unfortunately, you do not get access to the Patreon content. Patreon is where I want to see you. The final way of supporting the show is grabbing some merch. So you can grab a t-shirt, a tote bag, fridge magnets, you can grab laptop cases, posters for the wall, all of these things. Mugs. Did I mention mugs? I'm literally drinking from a What Magic Is This mug while I make What Magic Is This. Do you hear that? That was me taking a sip from my What Magic Is This mug. Delicious. All you have to do if you want to grab any merchandise is head to whatmagicisthis.com, click on the menu in the top right, and then click on merchandise, and you can buy tons of items. So you can show the world just how much you love What Magic Is This. But yes, this podcast is basically my job, and it is the Patreon supporters that keep me alive and keep me putting out such high-quality content. So there you go. 3 ways to support the show: PayPal, merchandise, or the best, Patreon. That is where I want to see you. $7 a month. That's it. But all of these things are available at whatmagicisthis.com. So that's basically all I have to say about Manly Palmer Hall. I wasn't expecting too much before diving into this episode. I truly wasn't expecting to identify with Manly Palmer Hall as much as I did. Seemed like a very cool dude, somewhat inspirational, and just sounded like an alright, pretty swell guy. So everybody come on back to What Magic Is This, where I have far more of this wonderful, crazy, esoteric, occult magic stuff for you. Until then, I want you all to stay healthy, stay hopeful, and stay luminous. We will talk at you soon. Goodbye, everybody. Ta-ta.